Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning. I apologize for starting a minute late. We're going to talk to you today about using AI and machine learning to power the fight against financial crime. I'm very excited to be with you this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from, to have this discussion. Just a reminder, please feel free to send any questions through and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So your presenters today are myself and my colleague Charles, and I'm going to let Charles introduce himself right now.
Thank you, Livia. So I guess I started the company about 4 years ago, and since then we've been immersed in building the best possible team to try and eliminate terrorist financing, and it was a huge pleasure to welcome Liv to the team a few months ago. Liv has a very illustrious history in the financial crime and anti-money laundering space, is a recognized expert around the world for her leading opinions on this particular space. So over to you, Liv.
Thanks, Charlie. So as a reminder, Comply Advantage is a fabulous platform using artificial intelligence and machine learning to support your fight against different scenarios within financial crime. As Charlie said, I joined a few months ago. Very kind of him to give me the introduction he did. And previously, I was managing AML across large financial institutions globally. And it's been a very interesting shift to move into the technology, the underlying technology that these compliance officers use, having been on the receiving end and having to use the technology to perform my job more effectively. Just to give you some background and introduce the topic, there was a very recent Financial Times article actually last week where the Chief Executive of Standard Chartered, Bill Winters, spoke about how the increasing use of various forms of financial services has driven data through the roof. And this has both enabled stronger interaction with customers and their data and their financial services. However, it's provided greater amounts of opportunity for criminals to access that data and to access those systems and conduct financial crime. And he specifically drew out machine learning technologies as those which will allow financial institutions to evaluate that data quicker. I'm sure that you are all familiar with the issue of not having sufficient resources to sift through all the information that is available to you to fight financial crime. I'd be really interested at this point to understand what your key area of responsibility within your firm is. So there should be a poll available. I'm going to push the start voting button, and I'd like to know what your key area of responsibility is so we can get some idea as to where the audience sits within this topic. So I'm going to leave the poll open just for a little bit. I'm going to be asking, hopefully you can see the poll, to decide whether you are working within compliance and risk or within maybe the more technical side of the business, and whether you have more of an operational role. Okay, so this is interesting. It's looking like, for the moment, most people are putting themselves under other. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, so the audience seems to be split very much, mostly between technical and other. Good. We've got a few compliance and risk people that have joined, so hopefully the shared experience that I can offer will be helpful for that. Great. Okay, so 55% of our audience is coming from a technical background, and a quarter compliance and risk, and the remainder in others, half in our technical. I think it's really interesting to note that within this, technical experts are becoming more and more important within financial institutions, and that is very much indicative of what's going on with all the available technologies in this space. Being able to harness the data and make more effective decisions using technology has become key. I find it very interesting that half the audience is more technical than on the compliance basis. I think that would have been different and maybe even just a couple of years or 1 year ago. Moving on, I've alluded to it already in terms of the level of data and what is actually available to us to fight financial crime. And that's a huge issue with why we're not actually performing as well as we should. I think there are statistics that everybody knows in terms of less than 1% of the alerts that are raised to regulators are actually of value in fighting financial crime and identifying real criminal activity. Banks in the UK are spending upwards of $5 billion a year on this. And that's not helped by the fact that pressure is increasing. We see fines that are enormous being put on financial institutions. And although it started at the bank level, obviously that will be wider on small organizations and fintechs and all sorts of organizations that are coming into financial services and taking on that risk and having to deal with the regulatory pressure that is mounting every day. The commercial pressure is increasing as well as fines and regulatory responsibility bite into the bottom line. There's a huge pressure to maintain profits and maintain revenue and keep that business going in spite of the controls that are being put in place. Financial crime itself is increasing, as we saw from the Bill Winters quote. The data available, the means of access to the system available is enabling financial crime in a way that we haven't seen before. And something that I know I was very familiar with as a compliance officer is you always almost feel one step behind. The criminals are always a step ahead. There's always a new typology. There's always a new way of accessing. There's always a new way of harnessing those funds for them. And we always feel that one step behind. And current solutions are not keeping pace in that area. They're very static. And furthermore, the cost and the effort involved in putting in place new technology itself is hugely time-consuming and hugely expensive. So I feel like what we're left with is poor data informing the decisions that we make on a daily basis, high levels of inefficiency with the amount of data available, and technology that is not fit for purpose and remains static, when what we really need is something that can move with the times and move with the typologies that we're seeing. I'm going to hand over to Charlie at this point to go through some of the high-level issues and, well, the definitions around artificial intelligence and machine learning. They are two big buzz phrases that people like to throw in a lot. So what are we actually talking about? What does it actually mean? Just try and demystify those terms a bit. So Charlie, over to you.
Thanks, Liz. So I guess for the 41% of people on this call who are technical, or the other third who are other, I guess the kind of big exciting thing is like the whole AI and machine learning dimension of this. So just the kind of foundational definitions. I think many people are just going to believe that artificial intelligence, because of the labeling and terminology, is a kind of panacea. And given the apex of the Gartner hype cycle and the kind of onslaught of news surrounding this, people just assume that it's kind of this ethereal thing which can solve every problem possible. And there's no kind of attentive understanding of the specific nuances or range of actual techniques in practice. This slide has a picture of Blade Runner, which is the kind of fictional representation of artificial intelligence in the popular imagination. And I guess if you ask my mum, that's kind of the stuff that she kind of think of when she thinks AI, right? So yeah, I mean, I guess the specific point that I'm trying to convey on this slide is there's a distinction between what the term means in the popular imagination and the kind of hard science, the kind of actual graph, the actual kind of detailed underlying work that's going on in everyday life to try and actually get this into production. Should we move on to the next slide, or? Great, cool, yeah. So, like, another kind of distinction I like in terms of typologies to think around what this is this distinction between kind of the kind of full spectrum of automation. So for me, there are various kind of ways in which you can aspire towards full artificial intelligence and move from a kind of narrow artificial intelligence to a general artificial intelligence. And in the same way, you can move from a kind of human augmentation whereby you begin with a person which has additional leverage. So I guess in the kind of in recent VC terms, that's kind of the bicycle for the mind, right? So in terms of being able to try and get more out of people. But then also there's this, I guess with many innovations around Deep Blue or different mechanisms of playing games like Go, people have been excited by the extent to which the full automation can yield far more extravagant results than possible with augmentation, right? So I guess the Comply Advantage, the kind of key tactical insight for me was incremental innovation rather than kind of a kind of step change revolution, right? So, and in that respect, this distinction between augmentation and full automation is an important and powerful one.
Great, thank you, Charlie. Many of the concerns that I hear from people when we talk about using artificial intelligence and machine learning in fighting financial crime is, will the regulators like it? As a compliance officer, you spend a lot of your time concerned not just with the effectiveness of what you're doing and what you can see internally, but also how the regulators will perceive that. And certainly there is work to do around educating regulators and helping them understand the different technologies that are available. However, it's certainly true that artificial intelligence and machine learning in particular have certain criticisms that can be or have been leveled against it. So many people are concerned, for example, that it would lead to this black box scenario where we don't know what's going in to the system and therefore how the decisions coming out of it have been formed. And there's certainly been an uptick in questions from regulators during regulatory exams that I've seen firsthand and also from the press regarding asking compliance officers how they know the tool works, how they reach certain decisions, how they can evidence that. Beyond just the usual audit trail, there's concern that artificial intelligence and machine learning can lead to bad feedback loops or that it won't match human levels of accuracy. And I think it's important to really look at what regulators are saying on this. And we've got a quote here from the FCA, who are certainly amongst the more innovative, forward-looking regulators. And the key perspective is really that machine learning should sit alongside human decision-making, much to the point that Charlie was making. It's an augmentation, or not really an augmentation, but an enhancement of human intelligence. It allows us to harness the data that is available in a much more effective and efficient way and make more informed decisions faster. And those decisions be more effective, and hopefully in doing so, we can move the needle on the nature of crime that we're finding and on the amounts that are moving through the system. I want to highlight two particular areas within financial crime where I think artificial intelligence and machine learning could certainly help, and two areas where we can have a discussion about the intuition behind how we can use this technology. Screening obviously being key, screening being how we prevent poor actors from interacting with the system or entering the financial system in the first place. So we need to screen names at onboarding or at engagement with our business to determine whether these actors are bad actors or people that we have a certain element of trust in. Unfortunately, we're not always screening against the most up-to-date information, and certainly technology can help that. It can add context to decision-making. So rather than just matching against a name, we have other items of information that can move from name to an identity. To, is the person we're concerned about really the person in this news report? Is that person really the one handing over their passport and showing us their details? We can harness unstructured data, and this unstructured versus structured sources is something that people aren't always aware of, and in the distinction, a structured data source would be, for example, names going onto a sanctions list in an Excel doc in a very formalized structure versus information in a news article or a website, which is in that formal structure, which we can get information from. We can also get link analysis from these sorts of technologies, so identifying where there are links between entities or individuals, which we might not otherwise be aware of, and we can find those risks that are hidden within those relationships we might not see straight away. From a transaction monitoring perspective, once those individuals are engaging with our business and have entered the financial system, how can we detect suspicious behavior? So we use very rudimentary ways of segmenting our customer base right now. We might say large corporate, small corporate, individual, for example. Machine learning and artificial intelligence can help us make more intelligent or create more intelligent boundaries around the nature of those customers and how they are likely to act. We might put in place certain rules to say we expect this business to act within this form of scenarios, but actually when they go outside of that, we should highlight it as suspicious. Often those expected behaviors can change, both legitimately and illegitimately. So how do we use our behavioral analysis and drive it forward so that it moves with the changing nature of our customer base? And that's what I mean by learning typologies and adaptive monitoring. We can use technology to provide ongoing feedback. So as those scenarios change, as behaviors change, how do we feed that back into our KYC and into our onboarding system? And then for more intelligent case management across a firm, ensuring that you are communicating effectively and efficiently with all of the individuals in the chain, determining when a decision is appropriate. So dealing with that first challenge of screening and onboarding, using artificial intelligence to handle the challenges that entails. And the first one of those challenges that I want to speak to is really the nature of this data is that it's constantly changing. And I've shown you a few headlines here, really focusing actually on sanctions and politically exposed persons. But we live in very interesting times. Just in the last couple of months, there have certainly been substantial changes, particularly in the US and obviously in the EU as well, with regards to Russia and movements within North Korea. From a sanctions perspective, there are names being added to the list very, very frequently. And in addition, being taken off. So we often think about the risk of doing business with a sanctioned entity. There's the further commercial risk of not doing business or turning down a business opportunity with a name that is no longer on the sanctions list. So it works both ways, and I think we often forget that. Furthermore, with politically exposed persons, when a government changes, it can certainly take time to input that information into your system. Where artificial intelligence or machine learning can help is the ability to access that information much, much faster and get it into your system so that you can be screening against that information straight away. Oops, excuse me, I went too far. So, for example, in the database that we have and that we create on an ongoing basis, in the 2017 elections, we could update pet profiles live as they happened overnight. And that helps to minimize the risk both of turning down a business decision or which could have made a significant amount of money, or making a business decision to engage with somebody who actually, for example, went on the sanctions list last week perhaps, or yesterday. We can also, you can also have a screening tool which enables you to do ongoing monitoring of those individuals. So whereas you onboard a client last week and they go on the sanctions list yesterday, are you still engaging with a bunch of transactions or business behaviors with that individual, despite the fact that they were sanctioned yesterday? Legally, you have 5 days to screen your customer database, but ideally that's not what you want to be doing. You don't want to be backtracking on 5 days worth of transactions and behavior when you should have really stopped it on day one. So the first challenge is just how frequently that data is changing and getting that into your system. And for example, I mentioned with sanctioned individuals in particular that often that can come from structured sources. So you may have systems which, or you get sent Excel format of new sanction names to be input into your system and into your screening tool. It's not always that easy though. So for adverse media, for example, you're dealing with huge amounts of unstructured data, news sources, websites, and the ability to extract relevant, up-to-date information from that is often a huge challenge. One example might be a news source regarding a particular terrorist organization or terrorist group, which may exist before actual sanctions are put in place, as that can be a timely process as well. So how do you know that you're not engaging with a suspected terrorist prior to them being designated on the sanctions list? For example, you may be dealing with an individual who's been charged with fraud, and you want to make sure that that negative information comes into your system as soon as possible. Often these unstructured sources lead to risk profiles of entities and customers which are built manually. So currently, most of your data providers on these issues will have a series of individuals, possibly up to hundreds, manually screening data sources to enhance what you're screening against. Those often lack coverage. They are obviously slow to be updated. They can be subjective. It can be difficult to know where that information comes from. And often news sources, particularly with so much of this news source being online, those links become broken, they become dated, or they might be taken offline entirely. So you may miss that information. Sifting through all of those individual articles can be extremely difficult to do, and even if you can automate it to a certain extent, it can be very difficult to ensure that you've got the context right and that you're harnessing the right information. So what's the fix? The fix would be using smart data extraction. So you may have heard the phrase natural language processing. So I'm very aware that we have technologists on the call who are probably much more familiar with this terminology, but certainly within other areas of an institution you might not. So natural language processing is really the ability of a computer to read that source and assign appropriate context to it. And if you can use and harness that, the power of that, to extract data in a smart and intelligent way that can recognize the appropriate entity within a source and assign it to the right place and to the right entity, to the right name, to the right criminal activity, for example, you can screen against that in a much more intelligent way. Supervised machine learning is the process through which the tool will be able to infer a certain decision, and human interaction with that decision to say, yes, that's correct, or no, that's not, means that that system can learn from that decision and improve on a continuous basis. So with every customer interaction or with every stakeholder interaction with that tool, the process gets better. And as I alluded to earlier, to link profiles more intelligently. So if you are able to create or detect the linkages between entities and individuals, it may be, for example, ultimate beneficial ownership, which is a very hot topic at the moment, or links between Putin and those he keeps close to him, for example, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail later, that can add incredible enhancements to your ability to make informed decisions on the risk of dealing with one entity versus another. As I mentioned, traditionally, the companies that are putting together this data will be using analysts, so human beings sitting there sifting through articles on a daily basis. We've averaged that one analyst could do approximately 120 articles a day, so with 200 analysts, that may reach 24,000. With an AI algorithm, it could be at 5 million. I think the latest statistics is actually closer to 6.5. So that's per day. If you consider the amount of power that gives you, how up-to-date your information is likely to be, the depth of the search that you are likely to have at your fingertips, you can see the incredible power that artificial intelligence has to enable us to spot risks faster. So what does this look like in practice? I can talk about this in a very theoretical sense, but it can often be helpful to look at an actual example. So what we've got here is an excerpt from an article talking about Will Smith and advice that he gave his son as he was going into acting. So try not to keep your mouth open. Smith, who produced the movie, advised his son, although he added it was his wife who gave him the tip. A simple rules-based tool, and that's often what is being used, may pick up Smith and son and assign the identity of son to Jada Pinkett Smith, who is actually his wife. So here, although it's not the most criminal activities that we're talking about, this gives you an example of how a simple rules-based system that is looking for keywords for analysts to then go and look at may actually ignore the subtleties and complexities that are often prevalent in an unstructured source. Another example might be where Carney, for example, has been charged with stabilizing the UK economy ahead of the Bank of England and not charged with a violent crime, for example. Using artificial intelligence, we can actually pick up on the subtleties of that language and enhance the context in which these articles are being highlighted to us so that my analysts can then go through and manually search for further negative information. You might also have, for example, Tony Blair opening a supermarket. So maybe you have a rule in place to pick up articles on Tony Blair, but you don't need to know that he's gone to, I don't know if Tony Blair opened a Sainsbury's anytime recently, but that's probably not the nature of the article that you're hoping to pick up. Another example, which I spoke to earlier when I spoke about the close associates of Putin, when you're dealing with politically exposed persons, we are also required to look at relatives and close associates. So they may also have access to public funds or the ability to make decisions regarding those funds, and therefore they are high-risk candidates for engaging in business and transactions with. So why would you use artificial intelligence in this? Often, relatives and close associates, information on them will only be available from unstructured sources. You're not going to get a download of not just those individuals who have recently become cabinet members in the UK government or the Malaysian government or any other government. But even if you do get that, you're not going to get sources which include their wife, their children, and their close business associates. So we do have to search through huge numbers of unstructured sources in several languages often to get that information. It can be incredibly time-consuming for these manual analysts that are sitting there and doing that. And it's also very expensive. It can also mean, as I keep saying, that you'll be out of date for quite a while before that information can be sought. This simple rules-based approach really doesn't take account of how complex this issue can be. It's one thing to know that you have Michelle and Barack Obama as former president and first lady of the United States, but how easy is it to pick up on them, their daughters, perhaps a bit easier, but all of their siblings, who may also be considered of high risk for certain types of transactions, or at least to be monitored more closely. Really harnessing the power of artificial intelligence can drive our risk considerations enormously. So that's the screening piece, that's the onboarding piece. Where it can get really interesting and where artificial intelligence and machine learning is really driving significant changes in the industry is for the monitoring of transactions. I've put together a very, very, very rudimentary graph here to show you a couple of ways in which that can happen. So I spoke earlier to the fact that we segment customer bases in a very rudimentary manner. And that might be more rudimentary amongst the larger financial institutions where there are hundreds of thousands of customers which need to be segmented into buckets for the purpose of transaction monitoring. And those buckets might look like high-value corporate over a certain number of millions of dollars, or one, two-person enterprises, small, medium-sized enterprises run by one individual and perhaps a partner. Ideally, we would actually segment our customer base according to not just expected behavior, but actual behavior that we see in process. So that can be incredibly difficult to do. Machine learning can look at all of the data points across your system and cluster those data points together into appropriate segments. So you might see a group of data points come together in a cluster, and whatever lies outside of that is the indication of suspicious activity. This is called clustering or cluster analysis. So you see several groups of data points together. So maybe in the top right-hand corner are large institutions dealing with cross-border transactions on a frequent basis. And you have your outliers just outside of those clusters, and that may indicate that that is suspicious activity on an ongoing basis. So it's a much more nuanced and intelligent way of segmenting your customer base and being able to see where the reality of suspicious or outlying behavior exists beyond 5 transactions in a month, for example, when they do the 6, and that means that that's a suspicious activity. Or perhaps usually we only see transactions going towards this particular channel, and they've opened up a new channel and now they're going into new geographies. It can help you highlight risk within your organization. Perhaps you can see customers moving more into a geography or a product type that presents a high level of risk for your organization, and you need to put in place appropriate controls to handle that. Rather than that being a lag of several months or perhaps even a year, you can see that on a much more real-time basis. Not just in terms of handling your risk, but also in terms of being able to serve your customers better. Perhaps you have a product or a service that could help them in the behaviors that they're exhibiting and the changes in their business, and you can upsell off that basis. So it's not just compliance, but also driving strategy and potentially even driving revenue. From a fraud perspective, I know that the track of this webinar is really also have a fraud focus. It's not just the identification of these sorts of behaviors, but also something like face and voice recognition. So the ability of technology to identify somebody's face or their voice, for example, can even go as far as the ability of somebody to use a computer in an atypical way. Perhaps when they fill out an online form or when you enter your password or your login details, doing that in an unfamiliar way, in a non-anonymous way, can help banks or other institutions to determine that the person entering those details is not the real holder of the account. They can help us identify fraudulent activity in a way that we haven't considered before. Things like you might take a certain amount of time to put in your details, or when you make a mistake in your password, it usually takes one or two particular forms. But when somebody else enters your password, perhaps they're doing it a lot more carefully. They're copying letter for letter from a source that is on another screen, for example. That takes more time. That can indicate fraudulent behavior. So it's not just about the traditional kind of transaction monitoring that we might be used to. There are numerous other ways that are being generated every day to determine fraudulent activity and to keep your data and your finances safe. So to sum up, from my side, before I hand back over to Charlie to talk about the future of AI and ML in fighting financial crime, what have we really looked at here and how technology can help transform your compliance processes? Data is key. Machine learning and artificial intelligence will only ever be as good as the data that we have available to us and how we can put that into the system and the quality of that data. But there are such huge amounts of data available to us. We need a more intelligent way to harness it faster. The ability of technology to do that means that you have a database of up-to-date information on a dynamic basis from a variety of sources, both structured and unstructured, and that information can be added to your database in a matter of minutes. You can then spot your risks faster. If you are updating all that information on a more frequent basis, you can proactively generate risk alerts looking forward instead of retrospectively. It allows you to dig deeper in the information you have to spot links that you may not otherwise have been aware of, to identify connections which you wouldn't have necessarily found if you were searching through your information manually. It also provides you much more context so that you can decide not just does the name match, but is the identity of this person really the same. You get much more granular information and you can categorize and segment your customer base in a much more intelligent way, whilst creating full audit trails for every decision that's made and handle that through your organization through an effective case management tool. And all of that can be enhanced using artificial intelligence and machine learning. I'm going to hand back to Charlie to talk about the future of this technology and where it can really take us.
Great, thanks Liz. So this is actually the last slide before we move to Q&A. I guess just the kind of broad roundup of where we are now and where we think we'll be going in the future. So if you look at the past, there have been very large periods of time where AI has made no progress, famously the AI winter. So I think what you see in the past 3 years is a massive surge of interest, investment and hype in AI, and that's really begun to capture people's imagination. I think what you've also seen is a lot of speculative money and investment in AI, which has driven up the price of the people who are actually creating AI, which is the engineers and developers at the forefront, right? So I think the kind of key challenge is that any investment or any kind of particular strategy around AI has to involve a lot of people, taking a long time, going around a lot of dead ends, which means that inevitably any project will be very expensive, very prone to risk, very prone to failure, and at the same time very expensive. So the core issue is that it's very, very hard. But I think if you are able to kind of make something work for you, then the benefits are very large, right? So I'd say huge amounts of potential, but definitely not without pain or cost. So I think that's probably all I have to say on that particular issue right now. But I guess, should we move on to questions now, or?
Sure. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it in and we'll be able to take it. I've got one question here on one of the issues that we spoke about earlier with regards to regulators and whether regulators are endorsing the use of this technology. There is certainly increasing interest from regulators with regards to the use of this technology in financial services and how it can best help them. So, for example, with the FCA, we've seen requests for input on a frequent basis regarding the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning for regulatory reporting, for the detection of suspicious activity, for example. We'll be engaging in a tech sprint next week on the use of AI and ML for anti-money laundering. And globally, we are frequently talking to regulators and to industry bodies about how we can help move the needle on this. There's a lot of attention being paid to the fact that whilst globally the amount of dollars that goes into financial crime, or rather that is being laundered through the system of financial crime, is increasing, and very, very little of it is actually being caught. There's obviously this awareness that we need to do a lot better in the tools that we use. So yes, regulators are engaging on this and they are interested to see how technology can move forward. There's obviously a lot of work to do, not just with regulators, but also with compliance officers to help them understand the tools that are available to them and how it can work for their business.
I think one of the questions kind of allied to that is this notion of explainability within machine learning. So I think lots of questions that I often get asked are, but it's a black box, and how exactly does it work, and is there any real way of understanding what's happening? And I think the kind of obvious way to kind of deal with that question is that often human decisions are subject to huge bias and lack of explainability themselves, right? So in terms of all kinds of human judgments, there are biases, there are problems, there are, in terms of recent behavioral finance or behavioral psychology, this notion of System 1, System 2 with Kahneman and Tversky, in terms of there are different ways of thinking, each of which is subject to huge amounts of biases, and therefore humans themselves have problems with explainability, and therefore you can't necessarily argue that the lack of explainability within machine learning is particularly unique.
Okay, so I'm just reading through some of the questions that we've got. Common challenges in the field when companies try to adopt this, a bias between technology challenges or cultural challenges. I think, and Charlie can definitely speak to this as well, that there's a bit of both. So the adoption of technology is in itself a cultural challenge. Compliance, I think, as a field hasn't always moved as fast as some of the businesses around it need to, trying to be diplomatic. So the adoption of technology in this is in itself a cultural challenge. And the change that we're certainly seeing is as more fintech type companies come into financial services, they're obviously much more amenable to the use of technology, to the ability to do everything through an API on a cloud-based service, for example. And much as fintechs are changing the way business is conducted and strategy is implemented, the use of such tools, I think, of tools like this to fight financial crime and to structure entire compliance organizations around is changing as well. And I definitely think that banks will have to keep pace with that. Not even just because of the amount of data they have available to them means that the use of only human tool or 2 eyes and 2 hands is actually impossible as we move forward.
Just on that point, so I mean, personally, I make a distinction between if you adopt a solution like Apply Advantage, then it's super easy and there are no challenges, either technology or cultural, right? So, but then I guess to try and, if you want to use AI yourself, then I think there are obviously both huge cultural, technology, intellectual. So, I mean, it's far easier to simply consume, like, for instance, what we produce than try and, it's far easier to use a provider who might use it rather than try and do it yourself. So in terms of, it's simply a tool which like electricity, suffuses all systems and can be used in various ways, each which require nuance and understanding. And therefore, like, if you adopt a provider which is using it, that's far easier than trying to do it yourself.
Got a really interesting question here, which I think Charlie can speak to better than I can. What are the requirements for implementing this? Do you need a team of data scientists? Is it plug and play? Can you shed some light on the realities and the practicalities? I think, as we mentioned at the beginning, I joined Apply Advantage a few months ago, and I'm very much learning with regards to the implementation and how it works. But Charlie has a much more deeper history in this, so I'll let him answer.
Yes, I mean, I guess, so we're now like nearly 90 people, and the vast majority of the team are doing this, right? So we spent the past how many years building and recruiting and training a huge team to be able to do this, right? So I would argue, I mean, that the kind of challenges in doing this are kind of huge, right? And there have been many companies that have tried to do what we're doing and failed, right? So, and it's taken us huge amounts of money and time and effort to kind of find these people and build the system. So yeah, I mean, the requirements are absolutely huge, and had I known what we were getting into, I probably wouldn't have even tried to do it, because there are so many things that you might not realize, all the unknown unknowns, right? So it's precisely the opposite of plug and play, whereas I guess what we've done in terms of what we've produced is something that is plug and play, but what we've made isn't plug and play. So if you consume our system or API, super easy, right? And we deliberately made it super easy. But the kind of journey we've been through has been anything but.
But the brilliant thing of using these sorts of technologies is, even though, as Charlie said, creating the tool and creating technology has been phenomenally difficult and phenomenally challenging. When you have incredibly smart engineers and technologists, you can put that into a tool which allows us clients to literally plug and play and to do so on an API basis in a cloud-based system, which is very different to legacy systems and legacy tools where we've heard stories of systems taking between 6 months and a year to really implement at a high level of cost, instead of just entering in API code and having it work with your system. Okay. Let's see. Anything else? Can you recommend some key questions we should ask when choosing machine learning and artificial intelligence anti-fraud systems? So I can certainly provide my perspective on that, having been someone who had to choose the systems and implement it into my existing database and customer tools. I think you really need to think about firstly the practicalities of the implementation. So how difficult is it to implement the system? How can it interact with your client base? Can it work with your CRM, for example? Can it feed back into that? How easy is it to see other information within your organization that may help you make decisions? Are the scenarios and the tools that they use to detect fraud, to detect money laundering, are they in line with what your business actually does. There's no point in choosing something which works for large corporates if your clients are small individuals. So making sure that, not small individuals, small companies or individuals, you need to make sure that the scenarios that they have in place are actually relevant to your business. I would want to know that it's very configurable. So to avoid that, that example of where you are stuck with a system which doesn't change as your business changes, you want to make sure that you can make changes to that system in a way that is quick and easy. I would also check that it is up to date in terms of the typologies that it has access to and the latest methods that are being used. So I'm actually being prompted that the webinar is now 2 minutes over and we're going to be cut off, so I'm afraid I can't take any more questions. We will be attaching the presentation and a couple of other articles as well for you to go through and to read. Thank you so much for joining. Hope that it was helpful. Have a great day.